said we couldn't dance, then said we couldn't drink. And unless some man allowed it, they said we couldn't think. They said we shouldn't speak till we were spoken to. Well, there was just so much back then we weren't allowed to do. But the first bite of that apple, I guess, revealed the truth. That's when Eve got smart, and that's why Adam don't like fruit. But that old tree of knowledge had some limbs that broke. We had to fight for women's rights. They said we couldn't vote. It is the duty of the women of this country to secure for themselves the sacred right to vote.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As a reminder, this session is being recorded and will be documented on the library's website for public viewing. We welcome questions in the chat box and we'll address at the end of the presentation. We'll also post a survey link to get your feedback on this session. We're excited to co-host this session with the Morgantown Now. I'm Sally Brown-Deskins, Exhibits Coordinator for WVU Libraries and Lead Curator of Undefeated, Canvassing the Politics Around Voter Suppression Since Women's Suffrage. I'm honored to turn this over to Delegate Barbara Evans Fleischauer to introduce this virtual program on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, granting women the right to vote. Delegate Fleischauer is the current minority chair for the West Virginia House of Delegates Judiciary Committee and the longest serving female member of the West Virginia House of Delegates. She met Smeal when in high school through relatives who were city, state, and national NOW activists. Delegate Fleischauer, a graduate of WVU College of Law, was later elected president of West Virginia Now. This program is partially sponsored by the West Virginia Humanities Council. Welcome, Delegate Fleischauer. Thanks for being here.
Okay. Thanks to all the groups that were involved in setting up this speakers series. And oh, I can see Carol McCullough. That's so exciting.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, there's a lot of wonderful people that are joining us here. We are so excited in Morgantown to be hosting one of the most prominent leaders of the women's movement, Eleanor Smeal. And I'm especially proud to introduce her, in part because my aunt asked her to be a member of the National Organization for Women. Ellie, as many of us call her, is a three-time national president of NOW. And there were a lot of victories under her leadership, both in Pittsburgh, where there were many NOW chapters, and nationally. Sex-segregated want ads were ended. That case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Violence Against Women Act, which was sponsored by then Senator Joe Biden, was passed, and also the Free Access to Clinic Entrances Act was passed during her leadership. She led the drive for the Equal Rights Amendment. We are still fighting for that, and I'm hoping she's going to share the latest on that. She organized the first national abortion march, which drew over 1 million people. She and the National Organization for Women staged the first national march for lesbian and gay rights. And Ellie is responsible for coining the term gender gap to talk about the differences between women's and men's voting patterns. She is the current president and board chair of the Feminist Majority and the publisher of Ms. Magazine. She is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Duke, where she fought to desegregate the university. When she went there, it was segregated. And she's going to speak about the long struggle for women's right to vote. As many of us have learned during this year, it was really news to me and other people I've spoken to. A lot of women were not included in 1920. And I am going to make a special request that somewhere in her presentation, she will share with us the story about meeting Alice Paul at one of the national marches for the Equal Rights Amendment. Alice Paul was one of the main figures in the struggle for the vote, and she wrote the Equal Rights Amendment in 1923. And it's a wonderful story. So somehow I'm hoping you can fit that in, Ellie. And with that, I'm just so proud that we are having you on this day of all days. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Barbara Jo. You've been there for us so many years. Now the longest serving member of the House of Delegates in West Virginia. I can hardly believe that. Your Aunt Joanne would be very proud. And she—
My Aunt Barbara too.
Yeah, that's right. That's your Aunt Barbara too. And you had your family very, very deep into the women's movement. And I give them credit for actually desegregating the want ads. I was like just a helper in that. They were the brains, and Joanne and Jerry Gardner, who was her husband, and also very, very strong. And Wilma Scott Heidi, all from the Pittsburgh area, challenged the Pittsburgh press for segregated want ads. And lo and behold, it was appealed, and the National Association of Newspapers publishers got involved. And before you know it, became a Supreme Court case. And we had started that with a monolith, and had all the key people had written it themselves. And we got a lawyer to sign it. Anyway, to make a long story short, it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and we won 5-4. And it was sort of like magic. The next day, or very short time thereafter, the whole help wanted male, help wanted female, sometimes it said women, men, whatever, it disappeared. And the classified ads just were alphabetical by jobs. And anyway, the reason I always like to tell that story is it got us hooked on lawsuits because you really can have a big impact with very little money and just determination and a good case. And it was a good, solid case. The sad part, decision was 5-4. And I couldn't imagine how anybody could not see that as sex discrimination, especially since we could show that all the better paying jobs were under males and all the lower paying jobs were under females. And it would be very hard. In fact, we did a mathematical study, and this is a 1973 case, 74 case, and it showed that if all women only could apply for the women jobs listed, there was only 20 categories. And for men, there was more than 200 and some. So we had very few choices. Anyway, that's a long time ago. I wish a lot of other things had changed that much. But what you wanted me to do is even go further back. I think when we first talked about this, you wanted us to tie the current battle to the ERA battle. And it's pretty easy, actually. There's so many similarities. The big year for the vote was, as we know, 1920, when it finally ratifies, right? And now we're at 100 years. But the key years leading up to that, they had a flu epidemic, the great flu epidemic. We're in a pandemic with COVID-19 at the very end. They were opposed, and this is a story that is not often told, but they were opposed by the liquor industry, by the Manufacturers Association, and by other major businesses and corporations of their day. The Equal Rights Amendment, is been opposed by the National Manufacturers Associations, the Chambers of Commerce, major corporations, and the insurance industry. So big money of their day, big money of our day, needs to exploit a cheap labor force. And when we say that women don't get equal pay, someone benefits from hiring an adult for less money, and usually a trained, nowadays a very educated adult. So there's advantages in pay, but it goes beyond pay, because the insurance industry for a long time used sex discrimination for pricing, and for benefits. So women, for example, in health insurance before the Affordable Care Act were paying 150 to 200% more and getting less benefits on the excuse that they got pregnant. So frequently, though, those insurance coverage did not cover maternity. So they said that was the reason, but then 80% of the individual policies didn't cover maternity. Now in the Affordable Care Act, we put a clause: you can't discriminate on the basis of sex or race or other conditions. But as you know, the Republicans have tried to repeal it something like 75 times. And a lot of people think it's just because of Trump. But remember, the majority leader of the Republican sits in Louisville. He's from Kentucky. And the largest, one of the top 3 insurance companies, health insurance companies, is there. And they employ 46,000 people in Louisville. I think that has something to do with the whole thing. But anyway, going back to the struggle, Alice Paul represented the crowd that fought the outside game. In other words, they were picketing and demonstrating and marching and going. They got arrested for their activity out in front of the White House. They got sentenced to jail. Some were sentenced to 1 month, some 2 months. They started going on a hunger strike, and then they were force-fed. Alice Paul, as the leader, was sentenced to 6 months. Some of the women, by the way, with the force feeding, were never quite the same. It hurt their throat and the whole area of the neck. But anyway, they did. And what this wonderful movie on PBS just showed, that as they were, I don't know where they got this film, but the video, but it was taken in the day. If a crowd of them was arrested, another group went right up. And it was a constant. And they were not only having trouble from the authorities being arrested for saying the obvious, how long do women have to wait for equality? They were attacked by screaming mobs of men who were opposed. And so they went through a lot to fight for the obvious. Women should have equal citizenship in the vote. Now, Alice Paul got the sort of more militant tactics from the English. She went to England and studied what the Pankhurst sisters and mother were doing. And they were treating it more like a war. You just couldn't make your opponents comfortable. So she came back with the notion, I can't make them comfortable. We have got to make them understand that we're not going away. So she did the street action. Well, the inside was being led by the major associations that were also meeting with Wilson at the time, Carrie Chapman Catt. So we have inside-outside strategies too. By the way, they actually didn't sit down and get that strategy. They didn't even like each other, we understand from history. But on the other hand, it worked. You had an outside pressure and you got the inside. And finally, after years of struggle. Now, one of the things is I hate when they're being called suffragists only. These folks didn't just want the vote. The fight that starts in 1848 or thereabouts had lots of demands. One of the major ones was equal pay for equal work. That starts way back then. They wanted to be educated. Girls were, when they first started in the 1800s, couldn't get an education. It was for boys only. So they had to fight to get educated. They had to fight to first get read and writing. Then they had to fight to get into college. And by the way, the college graduates or the college students were going to girls' schools, and they were marching too in the marches with their signs. Also, it was integrated. There were quite a few African Americans and the women, and that show on PBS shows the struggle with the leadership of Black women. It was very, very key in the movement and frequently not mentioned. Anyway, basically, where are we? We've been struggling almost 100 years for the Equal Rights Amendment, and it was written by Alice Paul, who was the leader, who were the more militant strategies. After they passed the vote, she went to law school, and she decided that we needed a lot more, but they all knew that from the beginning. And she thought step 2, and this is only step 2, was to get equal rights under the law. By the way, another thing that they didn't have at that time, they win it at the beginning of the 20th century, is they couldn't, married women couldn't own property. So a lot of money. Well, anyway, where we are right now is we've got 38 states. We still have obviously a strong opposition, corporate opposition. They don't show themselves that much because in reality, equality for women is no longer a minority of the population. We now support the latest polls that the ERA Coalition did show that we were in the 90th percentile. People think that we should have it. And most people think we have it. But the reality is we do not have full equality under the law. And this will give not only women full equality. I don't know if you saw, Barbara, Joe, and the folks listening, if they saw that the Supreme Court ruled in June of this year that under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which it says you cannot discriminate on the basis of sex in employment, in essence, they interpreted that word sex to include the LGBTQIA community. Because in reality, it was written, by the way, by a conservative. So Gorsuch wrote it. So basically, and we won it 6-3. That wording is in the Equal Rights Amendment too, where you cannot deny equal rights on account of sex, is in essence. I just messed it up a little bit, but that's essentially what the Equal Rights Amendment says. So anyway, we think it will give women far more power to fight employment discrimination. And in fact, the important thing that people have to know is that it applies to the federal government and it applies to all 50 states. And when you add that up, the federal government itself, but you add the 50 states for sure, is the biggest spender and the largest corporations in the country. In other words, it isn't just a few people we're talking about, just that. But if you then think of the federal government, and in some states like California, as the biggest contractors, that is more pressure on ending sex discrimination. So I believe it will greatly improve our position economically. Then insurance is a state regulated industry, and basically it permits discrimination. Right now, the Affordable Care Act has outlawed it for health insurance, but it's still there. Discrimination for life insurance, pension plans, annuities, auto insurance, I could go on. So that's a big part of people's wealth and income. And then basically the other thing that we've been saying, we didn't say this in the drive of the 70s and 80s because we were at a different place on violence against women. But when we were working there in Pittsburgh and in that area in the 70s, and in fact, it's because of that work that the Pennsylvania has one of the best laws against violence against women in the nation. I'm not sure where West Virginia is on that, but it was originally viewed in the United States common law that it was okay. It was personal. It was a family thing. And a lot of state laws had the concept that the home was the man's castle. You shouldn't invade in that privacy. But what we have done in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and finally in 94, passed the Violence Against Women Act, we set a standard that this isn't okay, that this is assault, that this violates laws. And we changed the whole concept of violence towards a spouse, for example, or for that means a partner. So basically, we don't have equality there, though. The original law that Biden wrote with his very capable staff. And then another thing about Joe Biden that people don't realize, he not only wrote the law and fought it through in 1994, but every 6 years it has to be reauthorized. And every 6 years he was there fighting to make it stronger, to cover. For example, in 2013, we finally covered college campus kids. So essentially, it helps women fight sexual discrimination in the form of sexual assault and violence towards them. And it's very, very important. Again, the Equal Rights Amendment will help because what they did is, in the first court case, again, a national one that went to the Supreme Court on the Violence Against Women Act, they said that a woman could not take a civil right of action could not enter court herself to fight the violence. It had to be the DA or the local government, right? It had to be done criminally, but not civilly. And civil rights on this are very important, especially if she's a victim of violence and the spouse or whoever is the perpetrator has income that they're hiding or whatever. You can fight for that income. But it's more important than that. You can go into court and actually take on the government for not defending you. In other words, for the police authorities for not considering domestic violence a serious thing. A very important case is a case in Colorado where a woman had a protection order from a violent spouse. They had 3 little girls. And anyway, he had visitation rights for the girls. So this day kids had to be brought back for dinner or something. There was an hour set and he didn't show up with them. And she feared something terrible had happened. She started to complain somewhere around 6 or 7 o'clock, complained all the way into the, wee hours of the morning. And what happened is her hunch was right. He went to the local police department, slammed the car down, shot up the outside of the police department. The police ran out. He's killed in the confrontation. And in the cabin of the truck that he was driving were the 3 little girls. He had killed them all. So she went to court against that jurisdiction for not taking serious the protection order. And anyway, she lost. That went all the way up to, she lost. That kind of civil right should be there. And that's we believe if the Equal Rights Amendment is passed, it will help us in fighting such horrible customs that take not as seriously domestic violence as it should be. Now that was a long time to give you one question, so I hope I didn't speak too long for that. Can't hear you.
I have to figure out how to unmute myself. No,
Yeah.
that was really very revealing. I think it's really important that everybody thinks about the financial entities that are behind discrimination against women,
Right.
and how powerful the protection. One thing I would like you to talk about, because it's something that I have only recently learned, and it's kind of embarrassing, but the number of women who did not get the right to vote in 1920, and how many women didn't get the right to vote until much, much later, and
That's
how
right.
horrible it was. Can you share what you know about
Sure.
that?
Sure. I mean, change is very, very hard to win. You win a case, and magically, for the example, like the one ads, we got that settled very shortly. But when you're changing customs and culture and fighting really an established interest that wants to minimize you, even when you pass law, you got to fight to make sure it's enforced. And what happened is, this is an age in the 20s of the Victorian woman, the woman that is supposed to look good, but be seen, but not really heard, did not really have full rights. My mother, who was raised in that age group, she never kissed her husband until after they got married. I mean, the modesty was this major thing, and she wasn't allowed to wear a bathing suit in her family, or to go bathing. That was considered really shocking. The suits today, they would be blown away by. So you were in a culture that treated women very differently than we're treated now. And time changes. Now that plus you had absolute racial segregation in the South. And the Southern officials have suppressed the vote of both Black men and women for decades. And so you had the oppression of Black people that wasn't changed overnight either with the Civil War, right? And you had all the Jim Crow laws, but you also had all these customs. One of the customs, by the way, is that real men didn't allow the woman to work. They could take care of the family all by themselves, right? But then something happens called World War II. And World War II has a very liberating effect because 10 million men are brought into the military. And think about that, a lot of people. The population then was a lot less than half of what it is today. And we have, 1 million to 3 million in the military? It's a lot different. But I think we have over 1 million. But anyway, they had 10 million in arms abroad fighting. So what happened is manufacturers had to use women. And it was a very big liberating thing. They suddenly were allowed to work. And it was viewed as the patriotic thing, Rosie the Riveter. And at the same time, a lot of African American Black men went to war at the same time. And they were segregated. A lot of women went into the military too. And they were segregated into all female corps and treated lesser. But it's still, they got more freedom and more respect. But so what happens after World War II is that you see the rise in more women working, not as much. I mean, remember the 50s were to convince you that everything should be traditional. Now we can get back to normal. Kids can have should have a lot of children, families dominate, the woman should be a housewife. They did that because they wanted them to leave these jobs and leave them open for GIs that were coming back. But another thing happened is there was the GI Bill of Rights. So a lot of people went to college that never could have dreamed of it before. So that changed things. I mean, all this is a gradual change. And what you see is by the 60s is an absolute increase in the number of women. It starts after World War II, a dramatic increase in voting until I can't remember the exact year where we become a larger number of the voters than men are. That took a long time. At the same time comes the 60s and we're fighting civil rights, right? And so more rights for Black people. What is the Voting Rights Act of 1965 about? Stopping the suppression of the vote. By the way, it was passed in August, just like the vote, the suffrage was for women was passed in August. And so you're celebrating both of them. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had a tremendous impact on voting. And it helped African American women and men to gain more voting rights. Did they get equal? No, we're still fighting Jim Crow laws. And this present court had gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965 by what you had to do is have, if you were in a state that had systematically discriminated against Blacks, they had, if they wanted to change the voting rules, they had to get permission to change them first. That section was declared not necessary anymore by the current courts. And so that's why you had a return of more gerrymandering than there was. And we're now fighting state by state. Stacey Abrams is one of the people leading it. The Obama administration did. Eric Holder, not only fought it as Attorney General, but he's fighting it now with a nonprofit that is fighting. So we're trying to gain the territory that was lost. But anybody that thinks you do something to change the world and it stays there, I think there's a quote on the archives building, the price of liberty is ever vigilance, forever, vigilance forever, or something. I just about lost it up. But anyway, you got to keep fighting. You have to be you just can't relax on this stuff because you are fighting hundreds of years of discrimination. And for women, centuries of it for sure. I mean, how far back this struggle for us began. It's worldwide now, and we still don't have full rights, but we're getting.
Oh, I got it. Ellie, I want to hear more about what's going on with the Equal Rights Amendment these days and what we could do locally in Morgantown and the state of West Virginia and in Pittsburgh.
Right.
But I really want you to talk about when you met Alice Paul.
Oh, I didn't do that.
Well,
Yeah.
no, I wasn't going to let you forget.
I'll do it.
It's such a great
Yeah.
story.
I'll start with that so I don't forget it. Is that Alice Paul, when I got active, and I got active 50 years ago, literally 50 years the week. They had at Point Park College in downtown Pittsburgh a celebration of the women's rights, the vote, and I went to it. That was the first thing. Why did I go to it? I had met Joanne, your aunt, beforehand, and she suggested, she said, why is a young woman like you not involved in the women's movement? And I said, I can't find it. She said, what do you mean? I said, I can't find it. I don't know where they are. I've been looking. And she said, well, you just found it. We found now. I had gone over there to have printed. I was volunteering for Pittsburgh, Environment Pittsburgh, I think it was called, or Pittsburgh Environment, one of the two. It was fighting for clean air, et cetera. And I went over, they told me that they had a mall lift at this house in Shadyside, Pittsburgh. And I went there, and sure enough, they did, and they would print it, but they wanted me to join now. And that's what I did. But anyway, it was very, very active. Pittsburgh Now was the third chapter to begin. And they had the president of National Now, Wilma Scott Heide, appointed people like me I got appointed to the budget committee nationally, but also she appointed an ERA committee. A woman named Jean Witter, I'm saying the names because some of the people who are on might remember them, who was a chemist, didn't know anything about, but she knew how to read and she knew how to study and she knew how to learn. And she and another woman figured out that what Alice Paul and them did was, and the suffrages of the generations before, is that when they were stuck at the federal level, they go to the state level. And they thought we were stuck at the federal level, so what they would do is push for state ERAs. And a lot of Pennsylvania has a very strong state ERA. But in addition, they decided to go to, because Pittsburgh is close to Washington, to go and disrupt the amendments, the 18-year-old vote, and stood up, a whole group of them, about 20 some, and said, how can you give, in essence, the 18-year-old vote when you won't deal with equal rights for women? And they wouldn't leave. Birch Bayh was afraid of throwing them out. So anyway, they got very active. And one of the things that happened, I think the woman was from Pittsburgh, we declared a vigil on the steps of the Senate. And we couldn't speak. We never did another one like this because it was just too hard. Your shift, you weren't supposed to speak for 8 hours and just be this silent conscience. Oh, believe me, we were not the type of people who did not want to speak for 8 hours. But the reward was that after it was over, we would go to the National Women's Party, which Alice Paul still was leading. She was in her 80s then. And we could spend the night there, but we could or have a party there. So we did our vigil, and then we all wanted to go. So we go to this house, and it's all dark. And I said, oh my God, we stayed too late. They obviously went to bed. I mean, it was sort of spooky too. It's a very old mansion that sits right next to the current Senate Hart building. And basically, a woman named Ad Pride, who was then one of our local activists, kept pounding on the door. And I said, let's just not do this. Let's stay at a motel. I was so embarrassed by this whole thing. And God knows what was on the other side of the door, but she wasn't going to give up. She kept pounding on. And suddenly a very small, we thought old lady at the time. I'm now that age, so I'm a little kinder on it. Opens the door and says, are you the now woman? And we said, yes, we're the now woman. And she flings open the door, grabs a bell off of a wall. I got my hands going beyond yours too here. And rings the bell, and I'm really loudly, and then runs up the staircase, telling all these other older women that they've come. And I'm now totally embarrassed because they all have their night clothes on. We got there too late. And I was thinking, oh, this is terrible. We're waking everybody up. And Anne turns to me and said, you'd be excited too if you waited 50 years for reinforcements. So anyway, that was the beginning. We met Alice Paul. We actually stayed there that night. She insisted on it. And basically worked with her a little on trying to get it out of the Senate. And that was stuck right then in the Senate. When it passes the Senate, we finally pass it, right? 1972, March 22nd. We run over to Alice Paul's house. First place, we were very disappointed. She didn't go. I mean, here's the person who's been working on this how many years, and she didn't go. And we couldn't figure it out. And we go there, and where is she? There was a party. Everybody's all in a great mood, but we couldn't find Alice Paul. And one of our colleagues, and she's still an activist in Pittsburgh, Phyllis Weatherby, took it upon herself to find where she was. And here she was in a back room, sitting at Susan B. Anthony's desk and crying. So we thought she was crying out of joy and telling Susan B., we did it, we got the next step. But no, she felt they had tricked us. And the reason it got out is that they had put a timeline in the preamble, which she was opposed to. And they had changed the clause and made it apply to the states as well as the nation. And she felt that it would be trapped in the South and that Sam Ervin had done this dastardly deed. Sam Ervin, becomes somewhat of a hero in the Nixon hearings, but he was not our friend on women's rights. And anyway, she tells us this. Now, we were all younger and we thought, oh, don't worry about it. We're going all the way. This is going to be terrific. She was right that it was somewhat of a burden. But as you know, we finally did it. Imagine that was 72 and it is now 2020 and we're still working to pass it. Now we got the 38 states. Now they're saying the timeline is important. We say it isn't because it's in, when I say the preamble, the states didn't vote on it. The states only voted on the therefore clause, the actual wording of the amendment. So they never had a say on this timeline. We think that makes it non-binding. So what we're doing this time is that we're suing first, and the states of Illinois, Nevada, and Virginia, the attorney generals have entered court saying, you got to recognize our 3 states plus the 35 that had ratified by 82. It gives us the 38 states required for amending the Constitution. They have a very simple brief that says, in essence, if you look at the amending clause of the Constitution, it does not give any power to the president. There was no Department of Justice. This President Trump has told Barr that they cannot recognize the ERA, and they have ordered that the archivist could not recognize it because of the timeline. What the attorney generals are arguing is the president was purposely let off not given power in the amending process. This was to be the United States of America. They're the only ones that have the power to change it. That was the Congress. The president was given no role, and there was no Department of Justice when the Constitution was ratified. So that's their argument. Now, in addition to that, though, we're doing two things, and we're supporting that argument, by the way, obviously. We hope the courts will observe that. We think it's the fair argument. But we're also taking no chances, and so we are hoping to flip the Senate from Republican to Democrat, because Lindsey Graham, who's the president of the chair of the Judiciary Committee, and McConnell have both said they will never deal with the ERA. They won't let it out for changing the timeline. See, when Virginia passed it, Pelosi and the House immediately, that was in February of this year, 2020, Virginia passes it at the beginning of the year. Virginia passes it, and then Pelosi and the Judiciary Committee of the House immediately move to remove the deadline, and we win that vote very large. But they then won't take it up in the Senate. So what we would like to do is flip it, have leadership in both houses that are favorable, and the timeline is removed. Now, we believe it can be removed because we already had extended it. And what the Congress does, one Congress does, another Congress can undo.
So Ellie, we've gotten a couple of questions, and I think I'll give them both to you. You might be able to answer them separately or together. One is, what's the best place to learn more about the Equal Rights Amendment? And another one is the interconnection between Black Lives Matter, intimate partner violence, and sexual assault being underreported among women of color, and movements to defund the police, prison reform. How does all that,
Together.
if it does, blend in with the Equal Rights Amendment? I think that's part of the question. Maybe not.
Right. What was the first part of that question? That was the easy part.
Well, there are two separate questions.
The second one with
Learning more about the Equal Rights Amendment.
Okay, there's a lot of places, but not as many as there should be. We really should have a lot more material out there. But the ERA Coalition has material on its thing. The Alice Paul Foundation has material on its website. We have material on our website, the Feminist Majority Foundation. So there's, you can see stuff on the internet through going to people's websites. But I do think the definitive works have not been written yet. I'm very believe that we need more literature on the Equal Rights Amendment. But you can, it's there if you look for it, but it isn't in one place. But how are the movements interconnected is what that second question is. They're very interconnected. The women's movement of today owes a debt to the civil rights movement. Remember, we amend the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Martha Griffiths, who was the chief sponsor of the ERA, amends Title VII to include sex discrimination as well as race discrimination. That's very important. Title IX, they tried to amend the clause on education, but it didn't go through. So Griffiths and a woman named Edith Green, I like to say people's names because real people do these things and they deserve credit. There's a handful of women in Congress, I think about not quite 3% in the early 1970s. But that handful was a real smart handful. And they amend the educational acts finally in 72, so that at the same time we're going through with the ERA, that you cannot discriminate on the basis of sex in federally funded educational programs. Well, there's a lot of programs that are not federally funded, by the state. So they're not covered, but that is covered. Now, some states have little Title IX, but not all. So what we were doing, a lot of us were involved in the civil rights movement. People who fight for social justice, they fight for social justice. And so a lot of us a lot of the early NOW members of the 60s and 70s, we came out of the civil rights movement. It's where we first learned picketing and demonstrating and marching. And basically, we believe in ending racial discrimination, and we believe in ending sex discrimination, and then we believe in ending LGBTQ discrimination. We want to not have discrimination on the basis of a attribute that you were born on. I mean, it's just, we are equal. All people are equal. So in rights under the law is the premise. Now, how does it even fit on domestic violence? One of the problems we have with domestic violence, and this is both Black and white, Hispanic, whatever the ethnic background, is that the police have to act. Well, a lot of the police, we've done studies, have shown that they disproportionately have records of violence themselves, domestic. So you're getting, one of our studies showed it was something like 40%. A lot of them have military training. That military training, that police training, is that you use force to get your way. It's permissible to use force to get people to obey. Now we're saying, no, you can't use force to get them to obey you. You don't have any rights in your house to do this, right? So the sympathy, the other thing is the police force is disproportionately male. And it's disproportionately white. So the feminist movement, and Pittsburgh was one of the groups that did it, Pittsburgh Now, in Pittsburgh, now in Pittsburgh, in Philadelphia, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, and literally quite a few states, started to sue the police departments for discrimination against women. And we always did our cases in together with the NAACP. So the Pittsburgh case, for example, it was NAACP and the National Organization for Women suing to end sex and race discrimination in the police force. But we knew we had a problem with police enforcement, and you can see what's happened with police brutality. Another interesting thing is studies have shown as you increase the number of women in the police force, brutality goes down. Women have a belief they can talk and through conversation and discussion, they don't have to use force. They think that women have been trained since they were young that they didn't have the ability to use force. So they would compensate by, let's everybody sit down, let's talk this out. You're getting too excited. So we have for years, we that went the universal we of the feminist movement and the civil rights movement has said it should not, that you're over policing in poor areas. You're over policing in minority areas racially, and you're over police, and you're under policing when it comes to sexual violence. But also the concept of policing has to change. You need to, when you're going out for a domestic dispute, you don't need people with guns as much as you need people who are trained social workers who maybe can figure out what the heck you do to solve this. This is a serious problem. And violence against women, no matter what the race, is a very high problem. In other words, it's 1 in 5 co-eds could be raped or assaulted. And I say co-eds, I know that's old-fashioned, but young women going to college. 1 in 4, we believe the domestic violence figures are. So survivors, but now a Black woman has a double bind, because you see that the police coming out are frequently whites who are prejudiced, or they're afraid they're prejudiced, maybe they're not. But when you see all this police brutality, as we are right now going through another crisis over it, you can see why they're reluctant to call 911 or to get help. So anyway, you can see, I don't know if I made that clear, but the movements are intertwined a lot. We're using each other's laws, and basically we work together. I mean, Now's been on the Leadership Conference for Civil Rights and Human Rights and Executive Committee since I was president. They still, they have a seat on that. But most importantly, we work together. We know each other, and we got to end discrimination. It is wasting people's lives. It's a disgrace.
So there was a question earlier about what people can do locally. But there's also a question here from Jean Clark, which is a fun one, and maybe as somebody else. In all the work you've done, what has brought you the most joy, or where did you have the most fun?
I don't know. Jean will know. We should say that Jean Clark is one of the great organizers of NOW in Western Pennsylvania and nationwide. She was the press secretary for the communication secretary for the ERA movement at various times, and I don't know. She's done everything. She likes to have fun. I don't know. I like to have fun too, but I don't know. I think that when you win, you feel a lot better than when you lose, and you try not to lose too often. But I think if I had to really think it through, although we have made progress, it's been far too slow. And I personally think that we don't have time anymore. The country in the world is facing climate change that we should all be working on. Talent of women, people of color should not be wasted in a fight for what is obvious. Of course, we should have equal rights. That should be not something that we're fighting about. We shouldn't have this police brutality thing going on. That is just an outrage. And we just got to understand that we're all in this together. And right now, if we don't turn to climate change very soon, we're not going to leave the future generations much at all. I mean, think of what we got right now, pandemic, and we're organizing for a referendum in Louisiana. And right now, 2 hurricanes, not one, at the same time are coming through that Gulf, causing major flooding and damage. 60,000 people have had to evacuate their homes. We all see what's happening. The storms are getting worse and worse. It's a part of the climate change. This is supposed to be a bad year for them. So we got that and the pandemic in Louisiana. And then we're fighting in Louisiana for the basic fundamental right to decide your own health if you're a woman and whether you can have an abortion or not. I mean, come on. It's 2020. I mean, it's staggering what we're going through right now. Yeah. So anyway, again, I got mad again because
locally on the Equal Rights Amendment, what can we do to help?
Keep it on the top priority. Make sure that your senators know and are voting the right way. You got 2 senators. Yeah. One of them went to Duke with me. I'm not the same age. I think she's younger, but still, you need both their votes. They should be voting with us. Remove that deadline.
Okay, that's very specific, and there are a lot of people on this call from all over the state. And we have a message from Judith Stitzel, who is the mother of women's studies. And Barb Howe is also, she's a mother of women's studies too. But Judith said, thanks for inspiration and courage across the years. And I think we are close to being out of time, and that is just such a important thing to do, is thank people who have courage. And I can't believe you didn't talk for 8 hours. That was news to me.
Yeah, That's
Talking.
yeah, no, you all,
I hope-
I want to say something to you, is that what you do there in West Virginia is very, very important. And what our friends in Pittsburgh, and I know there's several on the phone, all of them have changed the world too. I mean, and basically, I just think that the joy of life of this kind of work is you meet really fine people, and fine people and people who have fun, but also people who understand that it's our watch. We just can't stand there and watch this world go by. We can change it. And I think the best thing is that you get that feeling of empowerment, and we have changed things, not enough. So we got a lot of work to do. And I personally think that Pittsburgh and West Virginia, that whole Morgantown area, et cetera, it's some of the cradle of the union movement, and of civil rights and of change. I really do. I think that a lot of people think that, oh, the change comes from the coast, right? It's either New York or LA or something like that. But a lot of change came from the work that was done in the area that you're sitting in, and I believe Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania. And so I just think we got to make sure that we stay progressive, know that we can be, and know that this is it. We cannot keep on blocking things in the Senate. We've been in a situation where we put something on the books, the more progressive people say Title IX, and the other side fights to take it away. I mean, we got Biden et al. But not only did the Violence Against Women Act, they made Title IX have to deal with sexual assault on campus, and said that sexual assault and harassment is just another form of discrimination. In comes the Trump crowd, and they reversed all the rules that we put on the books under the Obama crowd. And what do we got now is that they're making it easier for no justice for the women who are victims of sexual assault. In fact, it's harder for them to even report. Well, we just can't keep going one step forward, this back and forth. We got to decide finally we're equal citizens. We got to decide finally that we're going to get rid of racism. And we got to deal with the medical and the real serious problems of our modern age. And we can do it. I think the movements right where you are sitting can make the change. I really do. Make it miserable for both senators, not both of them. I think we're going to have, I don't want to make it miserable. There'll be some people, just make them vote right. Okay. By the way, when we did the ERA extension, where we got a few more years, right? Bobby Byrd, the West Virginia majority leader, was not going to schedule it. And in an 8-day period, we had an immediate rally of only insisting that West Virginians come. 8,000 West Virginians came, and guess what? He scheduled the bill. He said he seen the face of his country. He couldn't get over it. That in 1 week we got 8,000 people to come. We just got to, and so you own part of the Equal Rights Amendment.
Okay, well I was not aware of that. That needs to go down in the history books. We are just about finished here, but I think I'll turn it over to Sally, who has some more information about other things that are in this series, this lecture series, although today was really, really a big one on the anniversary, and also about evaluation. Sally, do you want to take over?
Yes, thank you both so much. That was very informative and inspirational. Lots of thanks in the chat box. Thanks you for everyone for being here. And I also posted the upcoming virtual programs in the chat. The next one is September 25th with West Virginia storyteller Eileen Evans performing as suffragist Coralie Franklin Cook. And then we have October 9th with Becky Kane Kepperly, former National League of Women Voters president, on the impact of voter registration and turnout. and 2 others you can see in the chat box. And we really would be very appreciative if you'd fill out our survey. The link is in the chat box. And we hope to see you again soon. Thank you again. It was such an honor.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful
I enjoyed
program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
you.
Oh,
Everybody have a good evening.
Yeah.
bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yes, we. Bye-bye.
Hey, Jenny.
Hey, Barbara. This is great.
Hey, Deb. I see you too. Barbara Brown, I saw your cat. Carol, great to
Thank
see
you, Barbara. This was wonderful.
It
I
was.
enjoyed it tremendously. Yes.
We feel
Yeah.
very honored. And Amanda,